A judge issued a fine to a royal guard, assuming he was just a costume distraction, someone there for ceremony, not substance. But then the guard spoke, and in a matter of moments, it became clear this wasn't just a soldier in uniform. He was a Cambridge-trained legal mind. The judge had unknowingly picked a fight with someone far more prepared than he expected. What followed left the entire courtroom in complete silence. Before we dive into what happened next, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe because tomorrow, at this exact time, we're bringing you another unforgettable story about the Royal Guards. The morning of October 15th, 2024, started like any other in London's legal district. The ancient stones of the Old Bailey gleamed wet from the overnight rain, and the usual parade of barristers hurried through its doors, their black robes billowing in the autumn wind. What none of them knew was that they were about to witness one of the most extraordinary confrontations in British legal history. Lieutenant Malcolm Reynolds approached the courthouse with the measured stride of a man who had walked through far more dangerous places than London's courts. His ceremonial scarlet tunic was immaculate, every brass button polished to a mirror shine, and the towering buckskin hat that marked him as one of the Queen's guards sat perfectly upon his head. The morning commuters who passed him on the street might have assumed he was heading to Buckingham Palace for a changing of the guard ceremony. They would have been wrong. 3 months earlier, Reynolds had received a phone call that would change everything. Margaret Henley, a 73-year-old widow living in a council flat in Tower Hamlets, had gotten his number from a friend at the British Legion. She was facing eviction from the home where she had lived for decades, all because she had kept a cat that helped her cope with the depression that had plagued her since her husband's death. The fine imposed by her landlord was £50. A sum that might as well have been £1 million for someone surviving on a state pension. What had caught Reynolds' attention wasn't just the cruelty of the case, but the name of the judge assigned to hear it, Harold Blackwood. Over the past year, Reynolds had been quietly tracking a disturbing pattern in housing court decisions. Judge Blackwood's rulings showed a consistent bias toward wealthy property developers at the expense of working-class tenants. The cases followed a predictable pattern. Elderly tenants, disabled residents, single mothers, and immigrants were being systematically evicted on increasingly flimsy pretexts. Reynolds possessed a unique combination of skills that made him ideally suited to investigate this corruption. His legal education at Cambridge had been followed by 7 years at Clifford Chance, one of London's most prestigious law firms, where he had specialized in complex commercial litigation. His military service in Afghanistan and Iraq had taught him patience, precision, and the importance of gathering intelligence before taking action. Most importantly, his personal code of honor would not allow him to ignore injustice, regardless of the personal cost. The security checkpoint at the Old Bailey processed Reynolds without incident. His uniform was authentic, his identification legitimate, and his bearing unmistakably military. The guards nodded respectfully as he passed through, unaware that they were admitting someone who would soon turn their orderly world upside down. Courtroom number 3 was a temple to British legal tradition, its oak-paneled walls darkened by centuries of legal argument. Portraits of long-dead judges gazed down from gilded frames, their expressions stern and unforgiving. The public gallery was filling with the usual mixture of court watchers, law students, and journalists looking for stories. None of them paid much attention to the solitary figure in military dress who took a seat in the back row. Judge Harold Blackwood entered with the pompous ceremony that had become his trademark. At 62, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never been seriously challenged in his own courtroom. His face bore the soft, pale complexion of someone who had spent his career indoors, growing fat on the power he wielded over others. For 15 years, he had ruled his courtroom like a personal kingdom, and the bribes that had financed his comfortable lifestyle had made him feel invincible. The morning's cases were routine evictions, the kind of human misery that Blackwood processed with mechanical efficiency. An elderly man who had lived in his flat for 30 years was removed because he couldn't afford to repair a broken window. A disabled veteran lost his specially adapted home because he had installed safety equipment without written permission. A single mother with 3 children was evicted because she had painted her daughter's bedroom without consent from the landlord. Each ruling represented not just a legal decision, but a human tragedy. Reynolds watched with growing disgust as families were torn from their homes, their lives destroyed by the stroke of Blackwood's pen. The judge's callousness was breathtaking. He barely glanced at the paperwork, before issuing his decisions, and he showed no interest in the desperate pleas of the defendants who appeared before him. What the packed courtroom didn't know was that Blackwood was being paid £5,000 for each eviction he approved. The money came through a complex network of shell companies controlled by Meridian Holdings, a property development firm that specialized in buying up social housing and converting it to luxury apartments. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity: buy buildings full of working-class tenants, then use a corrupt judge to evict them on spurious grounds. The corruption had been going on for 3 years, and in that time, Blackwood had approved over 200 evictions that generated more than £1 million in illegal payments. The judge's lifestyle had improved dramatically: expensive holidays in the Caribbean, a new Jaguar in his driveway, and a boat moored in Monaco. He had grown careless, confident that his victims were too poor and powerless to challenge his authority. Reynolds had spent 2 months documenting the corruption, using his military training to gather evidence and his legal expertise to analyze the patterns. He had posed as a potential property investor, recording conversations with Marcus Pemberton, the CEO of Meridian Holdings, about their special relationship with certain judges. The recordings were damning: Pemberton bragging about how much money he had saved by buying judicial decisions rather than fighting legitimate legal challenges. The evidence was overwhelming, but Reynolds knew that exposing corruption required more than just proof. It required the right moment, the right stage, and the right audience. The Old Bailey, with its tradition of justice and its public gallery full of legal professionals, was the perfect venue. All he needed was for Blackwood to make a mistake that would give him an opening. That opportunity came during the morning recess. Blackwood returned from his chambers in a foul mood, irritated by a phone call from Pemberton warning him that someone had been asking uncomfortable questions about their business relationship. The judge's eyes swept the courtroom dismissively until they settled on Reynolds, whose military bearing and ceremonial uniform seemed to offend Blackwood's sense of propriety. "You there?" Blackwood's voice cut through the courtroom chatter like a blade. "Remove that ridiculous head immediately. This is a court of law, not a tourist attraction." The gallery fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Reynolds remained perfectly still, his face showing no emotion. He had faced down Taliban fighters and corrupt Afghan officials. A petty tyrant in a London courtroom didn't intimidate him. Blackwood's face reddened at the lack of immediate compliance. In his 15 years on the bench, no one had dared to ignore his direct orders. The uniform that should have commanded respect instead seemed to mock his authority, reminding everyone present that there were forms of service more honorable than his own. "I said remove that hat." Blackwood slammed his gavel with unnecessary force. "I'm holding you in contempt of court under Section 1(4)(b) of the Judicial Conduct Act. That's a £2,000 fine for disrupting my proceedings." The citation hung in the air like a challenge. Several experienced barristers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, their legal instincts warning them that something was wrong with Blackwood's reference. The court reporter hesitated over her keyboard, sensing that she was about to record something that would later prove embarrassing. Reynolds rose slowly from his seat, his movement deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat and argued cases before the highest courts in the land with respect. "Your Honor, there is no Section 1(4)(b). The words fell into the courtroom like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the gallery. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the building's ancient ventilation system seemed to hold its breath. Blackwood's face went through a spectrum of colors as the implications of what had just happened began to sink in. Reynolds continued speaking, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, but carrying to every corner of the vaulted chamber. "What does exist is the Crown Courts Act 1971, Section 9, which guarantees public access to court proceedings. The Armed Forces Act 2006, Section 369, specifically protects the right of service members to wear uniform in civilian buildings, and the Contempt of Court Act 1981 requires that findings of contempt be based on actual interference with the administration of justice." The legal knowledge flowed from Reynolds with the precision of a military briefing. Every citation was accurate, every reference correct. The barristers in the gallery began to realize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A member of the public who not only knew the law better than the judge, but who had the courage to correct him in open court. Blackwood's hands shook as he gripped his bench. The comfortable world he had created for himself was crumbling with each word Reynolds spoke. This wasn't some confused tourist or ceremonial guard. This was someone who understood the law, possibly better than Blackwood himself. "Are you qualified to practice law?" Blackwood asked, his voice smaller now, less certain. "I'm a barrister of the Inner Temple," Reynolds replied, "called to the bar in 2008. I practiced commercial law at Clifford Chance for 7 years before accepting my commission." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Clifford Chance was one of the world's most prestigious law firms, the kind of place where partnership meant financial security for life. The idea that someone would leave such a position to serve as a common soldier spoke to a character that was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone present. "You left corporate law to become a soldier?" Blackwood's question betrayed his inability to understand such a choice. "I left corporate law to serve something more important than billable hours," Reynolds answered. "I found that defending one's country provides a satisfaction that defending tax avoidance schemes never could." The journalists in the gallery were frantically taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing a story that would dominate the headlines. Sarah Chen from The Guardian was already composing her lead paragraph. "A serving member of the Queen's Guard today exposed judicial corruption at the Old Bailey in a confrontation that lawyers are calling unprecedented." The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting every word of what would become one of the most quoted exchanges in British legal history. The bailiff, a former Royal Navy petty officer named Thomas Mitchell, found himself quietly cheering for Reynolds while maintaining his professional composure. Blackwood attempted to regain control of the situation, but his authority had been fatally undermined. The man he had tried to humiliate had turned the tables completely, exposing not just Blackwood's legal ignorance, but his fundamental unfitness for judicial office. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely. Where once there had been the quiet resignation of people accustomed to injustice, now there was an electric tension that comes when ordinary people realize that power can be challenged. The defendants waiting for their cases to be heard sat up straighter, their eyes fixed on the drama unfolding before them. Reynolds had achieved his objective. He had provoked Blackwood into making a public mistake that demonstrated his unfitness for office. But the real purpose of his presence in the courtroom was still to come. The afternoon session would include Margaret Henley's eviction hearing, and Reynolds intended to ensure that she received the justice that had been denied to so many others during the recess. Reynolds was approached by several people who had been following the morning's proceedings. Margaret Henley herself was there, tears streaming down her weathered face as she thanked him for standing up to the judge, who had terrorized her dreams for months. Her solicitor, a young man named David Chen who had just qualified, was energized by Reynolds' example and spoke excitedly about the legal precedents that might apply to his client's case. "I've been so afraid," Margaret whispered to Reynolds. "That man up there, he looks at people like me like we're not even human, like we're just obstacles to be swept away." Reynolds took her hands, feeling the tremor of fear and age. "Mrs. Henley, you are a human being with rights that no judge can take away. Your home is your home, and the law protects that. We just need to make sure the law is properly applied." What Reynolds didn't tell her was that he had already set in motion the events that would ensure Blackwood's downfall. The evidence he had gathered over the past 3 months had been carefully compiled and delivered to the Serious Fraud Office 6 weeks earlier. The timing of today's confrontation was no accident. It was designed to coincide with the moment when the authorities were ready to act. Detective Inspector James Morrison of the Serious Fraud Office was sitting in the gallery, watching the proceedings with the sharp attention of a predator preparing to strike. Morrison had been investigating judicial corruption for 5 years, and the evidence provided by Reynolds was the most comprehensive he had ever seen. The recordings, financial records, and witness statements painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached far beyond one judge. The investigation had revealed that Blackwood was part of a network of corrupt officials that included 2 other judges, 4 court administrators, and 17 property developers. The total value of the bribes was estimated at over £2 million, with hundreds of families illegally evicted from their homes. The scope of the corruption was staggering, and the evidence was overwhelming. As the afternoon session began, Reynolds noticed the subtle signs that the trap was closing. Additional police officers had entered the courtroom, positioning themselves strategically round the exits. A second detective had taken a seat near the front, his attention focused entirely on the judge. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. as if everyone present sensed that something momentous was about to happen. Margaret Henley's case was called first on the afternoon docket. The elderly woman made her way slowly to the defendant's table, her arthritis making each step painful. She was accompanied by her young solicitor, who had been transformed by the morning's events from a nervous recent graduate into a determined advocate for his client. "Your Honor," David Chen began, his voice steady despite his youth. "My client has been a model tenant for 40 years. The alleged lease violation, keeping a therapy cat, is specifically protected under the Equality Act 2010, which requires reasonable accommodations for disabled tenants." Blackwood barely glanced at the papers before him. His usual practice was to rubber stamp evictions without serious consideration, but Reynolds' presence had changed everything. Every word he spoke was being scrutinized, every decision analyzed for evidence of corruption. "The lease clearly prohibits pets," Blackwood said weakly. "With respect, Your Honor," Chen replied, his confidence growing. "The Equality Act supersedes lease provisions that discriminate against disabled tenants. My client's anxiety disorder, diagnosed and treated by her GP, qualifies as a disability under the Act." Reynolds watched with satisfaction as the young lawyer cited the relevant statutes and case law. It was clear that Chen had been inspired by the morning's display of legal knowledge and was now prepared to fight for his client rather than simply accept defeat. For the first time in his career, Blackwood found himself trapped between his corrupt instincts and the growing realization that his every move was being monitored. The detectives in the gallery were taking notes, and several barristers were recording the proceedings on their phones. The pressure was unbearable. Blackwood's usual arrogance had been replaced by a growing panic as he realized that his world was collapsing around him. The phone call from Marcus Pemberton that morning had been explicit. Someone was investigating their arrangement, and they needed to be extremely careful. "The defendant's medical documentation appears to establish a legitimate exception to the pet policy," Blackwood said reluctantly. "Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Margaret Henley sobbed with relief, while her solicitor looked stunned at the unexpected victory. It was the first time in months that Blackwood had ruled in favor of a tenant, and everyone present understood the significance of the moment. But Reynolds knew that the real drama was yet to come. He had achieved his immediate objective, saving Margaret Henley's home, but the larger purpose of his mission was about to be fulfilled. The evidence he had provided to the authorities was finally going to be acted upon. As Blackwood prepared to call the next case, Detective Inspector Morrison stood up and began walking toward the bench. He was joined by his partner, Detective Sergeant Patricia Williams, and Reynolds recognized the coordinated movement of law enforcement officers executing a planned arrest. "Harold Blackwood," Morrison's voice carried clearly through the suddenly silent courtroom. "You are under arrest on suspicion of bribery, corruption, and perverting the course of justice." The courtroom exploded into chaos as the handcuffs clicked around Blackwood's wrists. The judge, who had spent 15 years terrorizing vulnerable tenants, was being led away like a common criminal, his black robes now looking more like a costume than a symbol of authority. "You do not have to say anything," Morrison continued, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. "But it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." Reynolds remained seated throughout the arrest, his expression unchanged. This was the moment he had been working toward for 3 months, the culmination of a careful investigation that had exposed a web of corruption, reaching deep into the British judicial system. The evidence against Blackwood was overwhelming. Reynolds had documented 17 separate cases where the judge had ruled in favor of property developers in exchange for substantial payments. The bribes had been funneled through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. But Reynolds' financial analysis had traced every transaction. The investigation had been triggered by Margaret Henley's desperate phone call, but it had quickly expanded to encompass a systematic campaign of judicial terrorism directed against the most vulnerable members of society. Blackwood had deliberately targeted elderly tenants, disabled residents, immigrants, and single mothers, people who were least likely to have the resources to fight back. The methodology had been ruthless in its efficiency. Meridian Holdings would identify buildings with low-income tenants, purchase them at below-market prices, then use Blackwood's corrupt rulings to evict the residents on spurious grounds. The properties were then renovated and sold as luxury apartments, generating enormous profits for the developers and substantial kickbacks for the judge. Over the past 3 years, More than 200 families had been illegally evicted through this scheme. The human cost was incalculable: elderly people forced into homelessness, disabled individuals losing specially adapted homes, children torn from their schools and neighborhoods. The corruption had devastated entire communities, all for the sake of property developers' profits. As Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, Reynolds felt a deep satisfaction at seeing justice finally served. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The investigation had revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond one judge, and there would be many more arrests to come. The courtroom began to empty as word of the arrest spread throughout the Old Bailey. Journalists rushed to file their stories. Court staff whispered excitedly about what they had witnessed, and the remaining defendants wondered whether their cases would now be heard by an honest judge. Margaret Henley approached Reynolds with tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "You saved my home," she said simply. "But more than that, you saved my faith in justice, Mrs. Henley," Reynolds replied. "Justice saved itself. Sometimes it just needs good people to clear away the obstacles that are blocking its path." As they walked together toward the exit, Reynolds reflected on the military principle that had guided his actions. The mission comes first, but you never leave anyone behind. Today's mission had been to expose corruption and protect the innocent, and it had been accomplished without compromising his integrity or violating his oath. The story of the Old Bailey confrontation spread across social media. Within hours of Blackwood's arrest, video footage of the corrupt judge being led away in handcuffs went viral, and Reynolds found himself being hailed as a hero by people who had never heard of him before that morning. But the real impact of the day's events was felt in the corridors of power, where the implications of the corruption scandal were only beginning to be understood. The investigation that followed Blackwood's arrest would eventually lead to the prosecution of 23 individuals, including 2 other judges, 4 court administrators, and 17 property developers. The financial scope of the corruption was staggering. Over £2 million in bribes had been paid out over a 5-year period, with hundreds of families illegally evicted from their homes. The social cost was even higher: communities destroyed, lives ruined, and public trust in the judicial system severely damaged. Reynolds was called to testify before a parliamentary committee investigating the corruption scandal. His testimony, delivered in the same measured tone he had used in Blackwood's courtroom, painted a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even experienced politicians. "The problem is not that we had corrupt judges," Reynolds told the committee. "The problem is that we created a system where corruption could flourish without detection. When judicial oversight is inadequate and financial controls are weak, we should not be surprised when some judges succumb to temptation." His recommendations for reform were comprehensive and practical: mandatory financial audits for all judges, regular rotation of judicial assignments, increased salaries to reduce the temptation of corruption, and the establishment of an independent body to investigate complaints against judges. The committee's report, published 8 months later, adopted most of Reynolds' recommendations. The Judicial Integrity Act of 2025 became law the following year, creating new safeguards against corruption and establishing clear procedures for investigating judicial misconduct. But for Reynolds, the most important outcome was much simpler. Margaret Henley kept her home, her cat, and her dignity. The 17 other families who had been illegally evicted were allowed to return to their homes, with compensation paid by the developers who had profited from the corruption. The young solicitor who had represented Margaret Henley was inspired by Reynolds' example. To specialize in housing law, David Chen went on to establish a legal aid clinic that provided free representation to vulnerable tenants, funded by donations from people who had been moved by the story of the corruption scandal. Reynolds himself returned to his military duties, but his involvement in judicial reform continued. He became a patron of several legal charities and regularly spoke at law schools about the importance of integrity in the legal profession. His message was always the same: the law is only as strong as the people who enforce it, and everyone has a responsibility to speak up when they see justice being corrupted. The Old Bailey confrontation had lasted less than 6 hours, but its impact would be felt for years to come. It had shown that corruption could be exposed and defeated, but only through the courage of individuals willing to stand up for what is right, regardless of the personal cost. 2 years after the corruption scandal, Reynolds received an invitation that touched him more deeply than any official recognition. Margaret Henley was getting married. At age 75, she had found love again with a widower she had met at a community center. She wanted Reynolds to give her away, since she had no family left and he was the man who had saved her home and her future. The wedding was a small affair held in a community hall in Tower Hamlets, surrounded by the friends and neighbors who had supported Margaret through her darkest days. Reynolds wore his dress uniform, the same scarlet tunic and gleaming brass buttons that had started the confrontation at the Old Bailey, but this time, the uniform represented celebration rather than confrontation. As he walked Margaret down the aisle, Reynolds reflected on how much had changed since that October morning 2 years earlier. The judicial reforms had been implemented, corruption cases were being prosecuted more aggressively, and public confidence in the court system was slowly being restored. Margaret's story had become a symbol of hope for people facing injustice. She had become a regular speaker at housing rights events, sharing her experience and encouraging others to stand up for their rights. Her council flat had been renovated by volunteers from the community, and she had turned it into an informal advice center for tenants facing eviction. The impact of the corruption scandal extended far beyond Britain's borders. Legal systems around the world had studied the case, implementing similar reforms to prevent judicial corruption. Reynolds had been invited to speak at conferences in Australia, Canada, and South Africa, sharing his experience and advocating for stronger judicial oversight. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of the legal profession itself. The scandal had forced lawyers, judges, and court officials to confront uncomfortable truths about the system they served. Ethics training had been strengthened, whistleblower protections had been enhanced, and there was a new awareness of the importance of judicial integrity. Reynolds had been promoted to major and given command of a company of Grenadier Guards. The promotion ceremony was held at St. James's Palace, with members of the royal family in attendance. As he stood at attention while the new insignia were pinned to his uniform, Reynolds thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The corruption scandal had made him famous, but it had also made him more aware of the responsibility that came with his unique position. He had the legal knowledge to understand corruption, the military training to investigate it systematically, and the personal integrity to act on what he discovered. These were gifts that came with obligations. 5 years after the Old Bailey confrontation, Reynolds faced a career decision that would define the next phase of his life. He had been offered a position as director of a new Judicial Integrity Institute, an organization dedicated to preventing corruption in the court system. The job would mean leaving the military and returning to civilian life, but it would also allow him to continue the work he had started with the Blackwood investigation. The institute was the brainchild of Lord Justice Patricia Thornton, a respected judge who had been appalled by the corruption scandal. She had spent 3 years raising funds and building political support for an independent organization that would monitor judicial conduct and investigate complaints of corruption. "We need someone who understands both the law and the practical challenges of fighting corruption," Thornton had told Reynolds when she offered him the position. "Someone who has credibility with both the legal profession and the public. Someone who has proven that they will put principle above personal advantage." Reynolds had been intrigued by the offer, but he had also been cautious. He had seen how noble intentions could be corrupted by politics and self-interest. He had insisted on complete independence from government control, adequate funding, and the authority to investigate complaints without interference. The institute would be funded by a combination of government grants, private donations, and fees from training programs. It would have the power to investigate complaints, recommend disciplinary action, and publish reports on judicial conduct. Most importantly, it would have the authority to conduct random financial audits of judges, a power that Reynolds considered essential for preventing corruption. The decision to accept the position was not easy. Reynolds loved his military career and took pride in his service to the crown, but he also recognized that the fight against corruption was a form of service that was equally important. The institute would allow him to use his unique combination of skills to protect the integrity of the judicial system. His final military assignment was training new Guards officers at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. It was fitting work for someone who had spent his career teaching others about the importance of honor, duty, and integrity. The young officers who passed through his courses would carry those lessons with them throughout their careers. Reynolds' reputation as the man who had exposed judicial corruption made him a popular speaker at the academy. His lectures on military ethics always included the story of the Old Bailey confrontation, using it to illustrate the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult or dangerous. Leadership is not about rank or position. He would tell his students, "It is about having the courage to do what is right, regardless of the personal cost." Sometimes that means standing up to a corrupt judge. Sometimes it means challenging a superior officer who is making a wrong decision. But it always means putting principle above personal advantage. The young officers who heard these lectures would go on to serve in conflicts around the world, carrying with them the lesson that integrity is not negotiable. Some would face situations where they had to choose between following orders and doing what was right. Reynolds hoped that his example would help them make the right choice. Reynolds' transition from military officer to civilian reformer was marked by a ceremony at Westminster Abbey, where he was awarded the Order of the British Empire for his services to justice. The ceremony was attended by Margaret Henley, now 78 and still living in her council flat, surrounded by the friends and neighbors who had become her chosen family. The award was presented by Prince William, who had followed the corruption scandal closely and had spoken publicly about the importance of judicial integrity. "Major Reynolds," the prince said, "you have shown that true service to the crown means protecting the rights of all citizens, regardless of their station in life. Your courage in exposing corruption has strengthened our democracy and renewed public faith in justice." As Reynolds accepted the award, he thought about all the people who had made this moment possible. Margaret Henley, whose desperate phone call had started everything; David Chen, the young solicitor who had found his courage in the face of intimidation; Detective Inspector Morrison, who had built the criminal case against the corrupt judges; and countless others who had supported the cause of judicial reform. The Judicial Integrity Institute had been operating for 2 years, and its impact was already being felt throughout the legal system. The institute had investigated 47 complaints of judicial misconduct, resulting in disciplinary action against 12 judges. More importantly, the mere existence of the institute had changed the culture of the judiciary, creating an awareness that corruption would not be tolerated. The institute's training programs had been attended by over 500 judges, teaching them to recognize the warning signs of corruption and providing them with the tools to resist temptation. The random financial audits had been conducted on 200 judges, with the results showing that the vast majority were honest and dedicated public servants. But Reynolds knew that the fight against corruption was never ending. New threats emerged constantly, and eternal vigilance was the price of justice. The institute had identified several areas of concern, including the influence of political pressure on judicial decisions and the growing problem of corporate interests attempting to manipulate the court system. Margaret Henley had become the institute's most effective advocate, speaking at conferences and media events about the importance of judicial integrity. Her story resonated with ordinary people who had never thought much about the court system, helping them understand why judicial corruption was a threat to everyone's rights. "People ask me if I'm angry about what happened to me," she would tell audiences. "But I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful. Grateful that there are people like Major Reynolds who believe that justice matters more than money, who will stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. And I'm grateful that we live in a country where one person's courage can change the system for everyone." As Reynolds looked back on the journey that had brought him from corporate lawyer to military officer to corruption fighter, he realized that each phase of his career had prepared him for the next. The legal training had given him the knowledge to understand corruption. The military service had taught him the discipline to investigate it systematically, and the combination had given him the credibility to fight it effectively. The Old Bailey confrontation had lasted only a few hours, but its impact would last for generations. It had shown that corruption could be exposed and defeated, but only through the courage of individuals willing to stand up for what is right. It had proved that justice was not just an abstract ideal, but a living principle that required constant protection and vigilance. The story of Lieutenant Malcolm Reynolds and Judge Harold Blackwood had become a legend in legal circles, a reminder that the law belongs to everyone, not just those with power and money. It was a story of courage triumphing over corruption, of integrity defeating greed, and of one person's determination to ensure that justice was more than just a word carved in stone. Above courthouse doors. And in a council flat in Tower Hamlets, an elderly woman named Margaret Henley lived peacefully with her cat, secure in the knowledge that her home was safe and her dignity intact, thanks to a soldier who had kept his oath to protect those who could not protect themselves.